The letter hit the floor of Pauline Bishop's kitchen with a sound like a verdict being read aloud, and she stood there staring at it, the way a woman stares at a grave she has already visited too many times. "You cannot simply refuse a neighborly offer, Mrs. Bishop." Albert Wallace's voice was steady, controlled, infuriatingly calm given that he was standing uninvited in her doorway, hat in hand, his shadow stretching long across her scrubbed floorboards. "The bank's notice is sitting right there. I've read the same land records you have. You've got 60 days and everyone in Cutter's Creek knows it." "Everyone in Cutter's Creek," Pauline said quietly, "can mind their own business." She picked the letter up from the floor, folded it with deliberate precision along its existing creases, and set it face down on the table beside her coffee tin, as though hiding its face might erase its contents. The Cattlemen's Alliance Bank of Tucson had delivered the notice 3 days ago. 60 days to produce $230 in back debt, or forfeit the eastern pasture. The eastern pasture where Thomas had planted the windmill. The eastern pasture where her son had learned to ride. Albert Wallace knew all of that because men in small valleys always know too much about their neighbor's grief. "I'm not here to buy your land," Albert said, and he took one step inside the door which she had not invited him to do. "I want to help you keep it. Get out of my house." The words came out lower than she intended, rougher, stripped of the careful politeness she had been cultivating since Thomas died 18 months ago, since she had built her silence into something architectural, something load-bearing. She needed it to hold the roof up. She needed it the way some women needed prayer or whiskey, and Albert Wallace, standing in her kitchen with his dark eyes full of that infuriating steady concern, felt like a man pressing his palm flat against the one wall keeping her standing. "Mrs. Bishop," I said, "get out." She turned her back to him and gripped the edge of the dry sink. Her knuckles went white. Outside the small window above the basin, the valley spread wide and brown and gold in the August heat of 1883, the mesquite throwing short shadows, the distant red cliffs burning like they always burned this time of day. Thomas had called this valley their cathedral. He had been a man given to beautiful declarations that left her no room to argue. She had loved him for it and resented it in equal measure, and she was not going to think about Thomas while Albert Wallace was in her kitchen making the air feel different. She heard his boots on her floor. She heard the door close. She turned around, ready to unleash the full weight of her composure like a weapon, and found herself alone. He had gone. She stood in the silence for a long moment, and then, because she was Pauline Bishop and she did not cry in the daytime, she put the kettle on. That confrontation was not the beginning. The beginning was 18 months earlier, or perhaps even before that, depending on how you measure the origins of the things that change your life. But the confrontation in her kitchen was the moment the whole valley leaned in to watch, and it is where the real story takes its first breath. Thomas Bishop had died in February of 1882, which was the kind of month that seemed designed for dying things. A fever that started as a chest cold and became something darker in the space of 4 days, and then he was gone before the doctor from Yuma could make the 40-mile ride north. Pauline had buried him herself, with the help of their ranch hand Dino, a quiet Mexican man who had worked their land for 6 years and who wept openly at the graveside without any apparent embarrassment about it. She had not wept. She had stood in the February wind and felt the cold go all the way through her, and something inside her had quietly closed, the way a door closes when a draft catches it. Not slammed, just shut. The Broken Spur Ranch had been Thomas's dream first and her co-creation second. 340 acres in the Cutter's Creek Valley of southern Arizona Territory, running cattle and a modest horse breeding operation that had been showing genuine promise in the years before Thomas died. They had 40 head of decent stock and a stallion named Governor that Thomas had paid too much for, and that Pauline had secretly believed was worth every penny. The land was hard and beautiful and stubborn, the way the best things in the Arizona Territory tended to be. She had carried it alone for 18 months, and she was managing. That was the word she used when the women at church asked. Managing. It was a word designed to end conversations, and it usually worked. What she did not say was that managing felt like holding a crumbling wall with both hands while someone kept throwing bricks at it. She let one of the two ranch hands go because she could not meet his wages. Dino stayed for half pay without being asked, which she accepted without discussion, and added to the long list of debts she intended to repay when the world cooperated. She sold 8 head of cattle to cover the spring taxes. She started the summer with 32 cattle, 1 stallion, 4 mares, and a bank debt that she had not fully understood until the letter arrived. The letter explained, in the measured language of institutional cruelty, that Thomas had taken a loan against the eastern pasture in November of 1881, 3 months before he died. He had not mentioned it to her. The purpose of the loan was listed as operational expenses, which was the kind of language that told her nothing except that her husband had kept a secret. The interest had accrued quietly for 18 months while she did not know it existed, and now it had grown to a sum that represented the difference between keeping her land and losing the part of it that mattered most. She was not angry at Thomas. She understood the impulse to protect a person you love from a weight you think you can carry alone. She had simply looked at the letter, then looked at the valley through her kitchen window, and decided she would carry this one too. What she had not accounted for was Albert Wallace. Albert Wallace had taken over the neighboring Rimrock Ranch from his uncle 3 years ago, when the old man's rheumatism made ranching impossible. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that looked like they had been formed specifically for hard physical work, and a face that was neither handsome in an obvious way nor forgettable in any way. He had dark brown eyes that seemed to operate at a slightly different speed than the rest of him, taking in information with a patience that Pauline found both useful in a neighbor and profoundly irritating in a man who kept appearing at her fence line with legitimate reasons to be there. He had helped her move cattle past the South Wash in the flash flood season without being asked, and she had thanked him with a coolness that did not reflect her actual gratitude. He had sent his man over with extra fence posts when the winter storms took down her north section, and she had returned the favor in kind, without allowing the exchange to become anything warmer than a business transaction between adjacent landowners. When Governor threw his shoe and came up lame, Albert had ridden over with a farrier from town without any explanation, and she had paid the farrier's fee and offered Albert a cup of coffee with such elaborate casualness that he had smiled at her, a small, knowing smile, and she had looked away. She was not unaware of what he was. She was not unaware of what she felt in the half-second before she remembered that she was not available to feel things. This was the betrayal she committed against herself regularly, the moment of warmth that preceded the door slamming shut again. She had decided after Thomas that the valley was enough, that the land was enough, that survival was enough. Anything warmer than that was a trap set by a universe that had already demonstrated its willingness to take everything from her, and she refused to step into it again. Albert refused to accept that, not in an aggressive way, not in a way she could cite as inappropriate or intrusive. He was simply, quietly, persistently present in the way that water is present at the base of a canyon wall, working into the cracks with neither hurry nor malice, just the relentless, patient fact of itself. He appeared at her fence when she was mending wire and talked about grazing rotations and the price of beef at the Tucson market. He appeared at the church social and sat at her table without asking, because the table was otherwise full and there was nowhere else to sit. And somehow the conversation about the poor wheat harvest that season became a conversation about books, because it turned out Albert Wallace read, which she had not expected, and which made everything slightly more complicated. He appeared at her door on the morning after the bank letter arrived, which is where we came in, where she told him to get out, and where he went. He gave her 3 days of silence after that. 3 days during which she drafted 4 letters to the bank proposing repayment arrangements, rejected all 4 as insufficient, and stared at her financial ledger until the numbers blurred. Dino watched her from a careful distance and said nothing, which was his great gift. On the 4th day, Albert came back. He did not come to the door this time. He came to the south fence where she was doing the mending she had been putting off, and he stood on his side of the wire with his horse ground-hitched behind him and his arms crossed over the top rail of the fence post, and he said, "I have a proposition that doesn't require you to accept anything from me personally." She kept working. She threaded the wire through the stretcher and did not look up. "I'm listening." "Governor," he said, "you know what he's worth." She paused, then kept working. "He's not for sale. I'm not offering to buy him. I'm offering to stand him at Rimrock for the season alongside my mares. We split the stud fees. My operation has the reach, Mrs. Bishop. I've got buyers coming from as far as Albuquerque looking for quality horses. You've got the quality horse. It's a business arrangement between neighbors." Nothing personal. Pauline stopped working. She looked up at Albert Wallace for the first time since the kitchen confrontation, and he was watching her with that quiet, level attention he had, the kind that did not flinch under scrutiny because it had nothing to hide. "Why?" she asked. "Because it's good business for both of us." "That's not what I asked." Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A small movement around the eyes, a slight deepening of the line beside his mouth. "Because I've watched you hold this ranch together for 18 months and do it better than most men would have. And because the valley would be lesser for losing any part of the broken spur, and I think you know that." She studied him for a long moment. A hawk circled something out over the eastern pasture. The wind came through warm and dry and smelling of sage and hot rock. 60-40, she said. "My favor." He did not even blink. "Done." They stood there a moment in the particular silence of two people who have just agreed on something that is not entirely about business. And then Pauline went back to her fence wire and Albert went back to his horse. And neither of them said anything further. And both of them were more aware of the fence between them than they had been before. Governor went to Rimrock the following week, which was a transaction that required Pauline to spend time on Albert's property, which she had avoided until now. Rimrock was larger than the broken spur, the main house a proper adobe structure with a wide covered porch and a bunkhouse that slept 8, the corrals well maintained, and the whole operation running with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested its owner paid attention to details. She had known this from a distance. Up close, it was more impressive, and she resented that slightly. Albert was professional and direct about the horse breeding arrangements, showing her the mares, discussing the breeding records he kept in a leather journal that looked genuinely well used, explaining how he handled the bookkeeping and how they would track the stud fees. She asked sharp, intelligent questions, and he answered them without condescension, which she noticed. Most men answered women's questions about ranching with a particular tone, half patience, half surprise, as if the presence of intelligence in a woman was an unexpected but manageable deviation from normal. Albert simply answered, the way you answer someone you assume knows what they're doing until they demonstrate otherwise. When the business of the visit was concluded, he offered her coffee on the porch. She almost said no. The word was right there, fully formed, the easy refusal she had been using for 18 months. Then she thought about riding back across the valley to her kitchen, where the bank letter still sat face down on the table, and she sat down in one of the wooden porch chairs and said, "Thank you." His housekeeper, a sturdy woman named Rosa who had apparently been with the ranch since Albert's uncle's time, brought coffee and a plate of cornbread with honey that Pauline had not expected and found herself eating without apology. Albert sat across from her in the other porch chair, and they watched the valley spread out below the porch for a while without speaking. "You're from Ohio originally," he said. Not a question. He had picked up this fact somewhere in the way small community knowledge travels. "Yes, Cincinnati. Thomas brought me west in '77. "Did you want to come?" It was a surprisingly direct question, People usually asked how she was settling in or whether she missed the East gentle, deflected questions, not whether she had wanted to make the journey in the first place. I wanted Thomas, she said. The West was attached to Thomas, so I wanted that too. And now, she looked at him. That's a complicated question, Mr. Wallace. Albert, he said, for the fourth time since she had known him, and for the fourth time she did not use it. She drank her coffee and looked at the valley. The valley that Thomas had called their cathedral. The valley she had stayed in after he died, not because it was easy, but because leaving would have felt like abandoning something she could not name. The valley that had given her grief and drought and a bank letter, and a neighbor who sat across from her on his porch and asked her direct questions as if she were a person capable of direct answers. I want the land, she said finally. Everything else I'm less certain about. He accepted this without comment, which was the correct response, and she found herself unexpectedly grateful for it. The first stud fee payment came in at the end of September, and it was more substantial than she had projected. Albert brought the payment in cash, counted it out on her kitchen table with the ledger open between them, and walked her through the accounting with a meticulousness that was either genuine respect for the partnership or a very effective performance of it. She added it to her savings and recalculated the gap between herself and the bank deadline. She was not all the way there, but she was closer than she had believed possible 2 months ago. She made the mistake, if it was a mistake, of saying so out loud. It helps, she said, staring at the ledger. This genuinely helps. I didn't expect, she stopped. Didn't expect what? To have help, she said. From this direction. Albert was quiet for a moment. He was still sitting at her kitchen table, which was its own small development, because she had not consciously permitted it but had not objected either. And now here they both were with the ledger between them and the afternoon light coming through the window and making the room feel warmer than it was. You haven't exactly made it easy for help to arrive, he said, and it was stated gently without accusation, which somehow made it worse. No, she agreed, I haven't. Can I ask why? She looked at him. She thought about the careful architecture of her silence and what it was load-bearing for. She thought about Thomas and the loan he had taken without telling her, and the fever that had moved through him like a wildfire and left her standing in February wind at a graveside. She thought about the particular loneliness of being a widow in a valley that watched you with concerned, pitying eyes and offered casseroles and scriptural comfort, and what it wanted in return was for you to be manageable, to be a familiar kind of grief, rather than a complicated, stubborn, inconvenient one. Because needing help means the worst can happen, she said. And I already know the worst can happen. So I'd rather manage on my own and be disappointed by my own limitations than be disappointed by anyone else's. Albert looked at her for a long moment. That's the loneliest way to live, he said. Yes, she said, it is. They sat with that for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, I'm not Thomas. The sentence landed on her like a stone dropped in still water, not cruel, not even pointed. Just true in the quiet way that some truths are devastating precisely because they require no amplification. I know that, she said, and I'm not looking to be anyone's burden or anyone's charity case, he continued. I'm your neighbor. This is a business arrangement that benefits us both. What I'm suggesting is that it doesn't have to be only that. Pauline stood up from the table. The movement was not angry, but it was definitive. She walked to the stove and put the kettle on because it gave her something to do with her hands and somewhere to look that was not Albert Wallace's face. Mr. Wallace, she said, I appreciate your partnership with Governor. I appreciate that you did not make it charity. I want you to know that. But, he said, but I'm not ready for anything to be more than what it is. All right, he said, and he stood up, and he collected his hat from where he had set it on the chair beside him, and he moved toward the door with the same unhurried economy with which he did everything. Then he stopped and looked back at her and said, I'll be here when you are. He left. Pauline stood at the stove and listened to his horse leave the yard at an easy walk, and she put her forehead against the cool iron of the stovepipe for exactly 3 seconds before she straightened up and went back to her ledger. October arrived the way it always did in the Arizona Territory, sweeping the murderous heat aside and replacing it with something that almost felt like mercy, clear skies of an impossible deep blue, mornings with a real chill in them, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold in the low light. Pauline always felt more like herself in October. The valley looked different, more honest somehow, the way things look when the harsh light softens and shows you their true shape rather than their dazzling surface. She rode her fences every morning, which Thomas had taught her, and which she had continued as both a practical necessity and a kind of discipline. The eastern pasture fence ran along the boundary of Rimrock's western edge, and more often than she would have predicted, Albert's morning riding pattern brought him to that same boundary at roughly the same time. This was probably not coincidence. She decided not to address it. They talked over the fence while their horses stood patient and warm in the morning cool. These conversations ranged widely in a way that surprised her. They talked about grazing land and the carrying capacity of desert range, and when to move the cattle between pastures. They talked about the Apache situation, which was always present in southern Arizona Territory as a fact of life, the complex, painful reality of a land that had belonged to the Chiricahua long before anyone with European ancestry had appeared to declare it theirs. Albert spoke about it with a directness and a lack of the usual settler self-justification that she found both unexpected and honest. He said simply that the land they were all standing on had been taken by force from people who had not consented to the transaction, and that the violence that resulted from this fact was logical even when it was tragic. Pauline had her own views about injustice, formed in Cincinnati where she had seen what industrial poverty did to people, and carried west where she had seen what territorial expansion did to people who were already here. She had never had a conversation with a fellow rancher that went into this territory. Most of her neighbors preferred to discuss it in terms of threat management rather than fundamental ethics. Albert discussed it in terms of fundamental ethics, and she found this disorienting in the best possible way. She also discovered, over these fence-line conversations, that Albert had been raised by a widowed father after his mother died of typhoid when he was 11. That he had read his way through a limited but serious library that his father had somehow accumulated despite their circumstances, which explained the books. That he had come to Arizona Territory not because of a dream, the way Thomas had come, but because of a decision, which was different, and which told her something about how he understood the relationship between hope and intention. That he had been engaged once, to a woman in Flagstaff, who had ultimately chosen the man her parents had selected, and that Albert had let her go without a scene because making scenes in other people's lives had always seemed to him a form of cowardice dressed up as passion. This last piece of information she turned over for several days like a stone with something interesting under it. November came with the first real cold, and Pauline's firewood situation became acute in the way that ranch problems do, suddenly and all at once. The delivery she had counted on from the timber man up in the hills had not materialized, and Dino's back had been giving him trouble that he minimized with the heroic stoicism of a man who would not admit limitation until he literally could not stand upright. She was stacking what she had, calculating what she needed, and estimating how badly this winter was going to treat her when Albert's wagon appeared in her yard with 4 men and a full load of split pine. "Before you say anything," he said from the wagon seat, looking down at her with that infuriatingly composed expression, "this is not charity. I have more wood than I need and a storage problem. You're solving my problem." She looked at the wood. She looked at him. "That is," she said, "the most transparent thing anyone has ever said to me." "Probably," he agreed. She stepped back and gestured to her woodpile area. "Stack it there, please." He climbed down from the wagon and worked alongside his men, which she noted because not every rancher in the valley would do that. She brought them all coffee at midday because that was what you did, and the men drank it gratefully, and Albert drank his standing up against the fence looking at the eastern pasture with an expression she could not quite read. "You're thinking about the loan," she said, coming to stand beside him. "I'm thinking about the windmill," he said. She had told him about the windmill over one of their fence-line conversations, how Thomas had planted it there, how it was the thing she could not bear to lose. "He put it in himself," she said. "Took him 3 weeks. He was not," she added with a complicated smile, "mechanically gifted. He fell off the tower twice. I told him to hire someone, and he said that a man ought to be able to build his own windmill on his own land, and I told him that philosophy was going to get him killed, and he laughed at me." Albert was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was worth loving," he said. She did not expect that. She expected something more careful, more neutral, the way people spoke about dead husbands around the surviving wife, with a kind of reverential awkwardness. He said it simply, as a straightforward assessment of a man who had built his own windmill despite not being built for it, and she felt something shift behind her sternum, some small internal movement that she could not quite identify. "He was," she said. "He was exactly that." They stood there looking at the windmill while the afternoon light made long gold lines across the eastern pasture, and neither of them said anything further for a while, and the silence between them was no longer entirely cold. The bank's 60-day deadline arrived in December, and Pauline rode into Cutter's Creek on a Thursday morning, with the repayment money in an envelope inside her coat and her back very straight, and her expression arranged into the particular composure she wore for situations that required her not to show the full extent of what she was feeling. She paid the debt. The bank manager, a dry, precise man named Kellerman, who had delivered the original notice with the sympathetic efficiency of someone performing a task they find distasteful, accepted her payment, stamped the paperwork, and told her in a voice carefully emptied of anything that might constitute warmth that the eastern pasture was now fully clear of encumbrance. She thanked him with equal emptiness and walked out into the December cold of the Cutter's Creek Main Street. She stood there for a moment in the dust and the cold wind, and she felt something enormous shift inside her, not joy exactly, but something in that neighborhood. Relief, maybe. Or its older, heavier cousin, the feeling of having survived something that had wanted to undo her. Albert was coming out of the mercantile across the street with a box of supplies under one arm, and he saw her and read her face with that quick, accurate attention of his, and he crossed the street and stopped in front of her. "Done?" he asked. "Done," she said. He nodded once, a simple, clean acknowledgement. Then he said, "Buy you lunch." She looked at him. "Mr. Wallace, Albert," he said. "And before you decline, consider that you've just prevented the bank from taking a piece of your land. It's Thursday, which means the cook at the hotel has her green chili stew on, and you rode 40 minutes to get here in the cold. Let me buy you lunch, Pauline." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. She had not given him permission for it, and she was going to address that. And then she noticed that the sound of it in his voice was doing something to her that the careful management of her feelings was not entirely equipped to prevent. "The hotel," she said, "not the saloon." "Obviously," he said, and there was almost a smile in it. They ate green chili stew at a table in the corner of the Cutter's Creek Hotel dining room, and outside the window the town moved through its December business, and the wind pushed dry leaves up the street, and the sky over the red cliffs was a pale, cold, beautiful blue. The stew was as good as promised. The bread was fresh. Albert ate the way he did everything, without fuss and without waste. They talked about horses. They talked about the price of beef, and where it was trending based on what the cattle buyers from Tucson were saying, and whether the railroad expansion would change the market dynamics in the next few years. They talked about a lecture series being organized at the school in town, and whether either of them would attend. They talked about a water rights dispute between two families on the north side of the valley that had been simmering for years and was threatening to become something uglier. Then they ran out of practical things to discuss, and there was a pause, and Albert set down his spoon and looked at her across the table with that direct, unhurried attention that she had come to recognize as simply the way he existed in the world rather than a strategy, and he said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," she said. "What would make you happy?" Not what would make the ranch work, or what would solve the immediate problem. What would make you genuinely happy? She sat with the question. It was not a question anyone had asked her in a very long time, partly because people in difficult circumstances are usually asked what they need rather than what they want, and partly because the distinction requires a kind of trust in the questioner to not use the answer as a weapon or a pity. "The valley in October," she said finally. "That feeling in the morning when the air is cold and clear and everything looks like it means something. That makes me genuinely happy." He nodded. "Books," she continued, because something about his attention was making the words come more easily than she intended. "I miss having enough time to read properly. Thomas and I used to read to each other in the evenings, and I haven't done that in a very long time." She paused. "What about you?" "This," he said simply. She looked at him. "A table and good food and a conversation with someone who says what they actually mean," he said. "I find that surprisingly rare and uncommonly valuable." There was a warmth in the way he said it that she did not deflect in time. It arrived before she could arrange her composure to receive it properly, and it sat somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there through the ride back to the valley in the December cold, and through the rest of the day's work and through the evening and into the quiet of the night. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside and acknowledged to herself, with the particular honesty she reserved for conversations she had only with herself, that she was in danger. Not the bank kind of danger. Not the land kind. The other kind. The kind she had shut the door against 18 months ago, because the universe had demonstrated its willingness to take what she loved, and the only logical response was to stop loving things. She acknowledged this honestly to herself, and then she folded it up carefully and put it away in the part of her that was not yet ready, and she went asleep. December became January of 1884, which was colder than usual across the territory, the kind of cold that came down from the north with a mean intention, freezing the water troughs and making the cattle stupid and miserable. Pauline worked from before dawn to after dark through this period, keeping the stock watered and fed and healthy, and she was deeply, productively exhausted in a way that left little room for anything except the immediate physical reality of keeping things alive. She did not see Albert for 2 weeks because the cold kept everyone close to their own operations. When she did see him again, it was at the Alvarez family's place on the east side of the valley, where the whole community had gathered because Jonas Alvarez had broken his leg in a fall and was laid up for 6 weeks, and his wife Maria had 5 children under the age of 10 and a ranch that needed tending. The valley turned out for these things, in the way that isolated communities must. People came with food and labor, and the unspoken agreement that today's help was tomorrow's insurance, and no one counted too carefully because counting turned community into transaction. Pauline brought a ham she had smoked last fall and 2 jars of preserved peaches, and she spent the morning helping Maria with laundry and the younger children while the men rotated through the ranch work. She was pinning sheets on the line in the thin January sun when she saw Albert playing with the Alvarez children in the yard. He had the youngest, a boy of about 3, on his shoulders, and 2 of the middle ones were hanging off his arms with the gleeful, boneless determination of children who have identified a willing adult, and he was carrying this whole complicated burden across the yard with an expression of such genuine, uncomplicated delight that Pauline stood with a sheet half-pinned and simply watched him for longer than she meant to. He caught her looking. His expression did not change into something more guarded or self-conscious. He just smiled at her across the yard, the kind of smile that is simply a person being glad in the presence of another person, and went back to the children who were now shrieking about something and demanding more of his attention. She went back to the sheets. Her hands were not entirely steady. Maria Alvarez came to stand beside her a moment later, a small dark woman with observant eyes and no inclination towards social niceties that cost energy she did not have. "He is a good man," Maria said, not looking at Pauline, looking at Albert. "Yes," Pauline agreed, because there was no version of disagreement that did not embarrass them both. "He has been alone a long time," Maria said. "People who are good and alone for a long time start to practice loneliness the way other people practice bad habits. It becomes comfortable even when it is not good for them." Pauline kept pinning sheets. "Are you talking about him or me?" Maria smiled, quick and private. "I am talking about the situation. The situation involves two people." Pauline thought about this for the rest of the morning and did not reach a comfortable conclusion, which was perhaps the point. February was when everything changed. It happened not because of any dramatic external event, not a disaster or a rescue, not the kind of thing that forces two people together by necessity, but because of an evening that arrived like an ordinary evening and became something else. She had ridden over to Rimrock in the late afternoon to settle the second round of stud fee accounts, which required an hour with the ledger and some discussion about the spring breeding season. Albert's housekeeper, Rosa, had made dinner and had set 3 plates because Rosa was operating on the theory, apparently, that Pauline would be staying, a theory that Pauline discovered only when she was already sitting at the table and the food was already in front of her. Rosa retired to her quarters immediately after serving, which Pauline suspected was not unrelated to the 3 plates and the general design of the evening. She ate dinner with Albert in the warm kitchen of the Rimrock Ranch house, and afterward he brought out a bottle of wine, which was an extravagance in the territory, and which he explained by saying a buyer from Albuquerque had left it as a courtesy. And they moved from the kitchen to the sitting room because the sitting room had a better fire. And somewhere in this transition, the conversation lost its business casing entirely and became something else. He had a bookshelf that ran the full length of one wall, proper books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, evidence of actual reading rather than display. She went to it almost automatically, the way she moved toward books, and he told her to take anything she wanted, said it the way you say something when the offer is real and not ceremonial, and she pulled out a volume of Whitman that she had not read since Cincinnati and stood holding it while the fire popped and the winter wind moved around the outside of the adobe walls. "Read something," he said. She looked at him. He was sitting in the chair by the fire with his long legs stretched toward the heat, utterly at ease, watching her with that particular attention. "Now." "Why not now?" She sat down in the chair across from him. The firelight was warm and the wine was good and the book was in her hands, and something about the whole arrangement felt familiar in the way that things feel familiar when they are what you have been missing without quite knowing what it was you missed. She read Whitman to him. Not carefully, not performing it, just reading the way she used to read in the evenings with Thomas, out loud because words wanted to be spoken, and he listened without interrupting, and the fire burned down, and outside the February wind blew cold and the stars over the Arizona territory were extraordinary, and neither of them thought about ending the evening for a very long time. When she finally stood to go, it was late, later than she had intended by considerable measure, and she was putting her coat on at the door and he was handing her her hat and there was the small necessary proximity of the doorway, and she looked up at him, and the look that passed between them was so unambiguous that she felt it from her sternum to her feet. "Pauline," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." She stood in the doorway with her hat in her hands and looked at him and felt the door inside her, the one she had shut against the February wind at Thomas's graveside, and she felt it the way you feel a door when something on the other side of it is knocking. "Give me time," she said. "I have time," he said. "I have as much as you need." She rode home under the February stars with the Whitman book tucked inside her coat, which she had taken without entirely planning to, and which he had watched her take without comment. And she rode across the dark valley that Thomas had called their cathedral, and she let herself, for the first time in 2 years, want something. Spring came hard and fast the way Arizona spring does, a sudden riot of color and warmth, and the whole valley turning improbably, gorgeously green for the brief weeks before the summer heat arrived to scorch it back to its proper desert self. Governor had proven himself magnificently at Rimrock, and 3 of Albert's mares were confirmed in foal, and 2 outside buyers had already paid stud fees that, combined with what Pauline had built through the winter, left her in the best financial position she had occupied since Thomas died. She acknowledged this one afternoon in her kitchen while doing the accounts and sat back in her chair and allowed herself the dangerous luxury of feeling something like security. Then she thought about what security meant and what it opened up, and she felt the knock on the internal door again. She went to Rimrock the next morning, not because there was business to discuss, because she wanted to go. Albert was in the barn when she arrived, examining the leg of one of the mares with his head bent and his attention entirely focused, and he looked up when her horse came into the yard, and something in his face did the thing it always did when he saw her, the thing she had been cataloging for months without letting herself name it. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and she swung down from her horse and tied the reins and walked into the barn and stopped about 3 feet away from him, which was closer than she usually stopped, and he straightened up and waited, because he was Albert and waiting was something he was better at than anyone she had ever known. "I finished the Whitman," she said. "What did you think?" "I think he was a man who understood that the world contains more than we are usually willing to admit," she said. "I think he was brave about it in a way I have been practicing not being for a long time." Albert was very still. "I'm not going to pretend," she said, "that this is straightforward for me. It isn't. I loved Thomas and I lost Thomas, and the logical conclusion I reached from that experience was that the correct approach to love was to stop attempting it. I have been implementing that conclusion with what I considered remarkable discipline." "You have," he agreed quietly. "And you," she said, "have been standing on the other side of the fence and talking about books and grazing rotations and water rights injustices, and bringing firewood you did not need to store and eating stew with me in the hotel, and letting me read Whitman out loud to you at 10 o'clock on a winter night. And not once in all of that have you pressured me, or made me feel like something I was supposed to manage rather than a person making her own choices." "No," he said. "I want you to know that I am aware of what that means," she said. "How rare that is. I want you to know that I see it." He took one step toward her, slow and deliberate the way he moved, and stopped. "Pauline." "Albert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she watched his expression do something she had never seen it do before, something open and warm and entirely unguarded. "I am not going to rush you past anything you're not ready for," he said, "but I would very much like to court you properly if you'd allow it. Dinner, rides in the evening, church together if you'd be comfortable with it. I want the valley to know that," he paused, choosing words with visible care, "that I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in this or any other territory, and that I intend to take every opportunity you give me to demonstrate that." She looked at him for a long moment. The barn smelled of horse and hay and the good clean smell of a well-kept place. Outside, the spring morning was bright and alive. "Yes," she said, "you may court me, Albert, properly." His smile was like a window opening. The courtship of Pauline Bishop by Albert Wallace was conducted with the same patient, deliberate attention that characterized everything Albert did, and the valley watched it with a range of reactions that included delight, relief, a certain amount of prurient speculation, and from 1 or 2 parties, the particular resentment that handsome men's freedom occasionally provokes in other handsome men who have been trying to get Pauline Bishop's attention and failing. One of these was a man named Gideon Prout, who ran a small cattle operation on the north end of the valley, and who had made two separate attempts to introduce himself to Pauline, in the context of what she had correctly identified as romantic interest, and politely deflected both times. Prout was not a bad man precisely, but he was a man with an inflated sense of his own reasonableness, who found the presence of Albert Wallace in Pauline's orbit personally offensive. He expressed this offense one afternoon in April at the Mercantile in Cutter's Creek, where he told anyone willing to listen that it was a sorry state of affairs when a man swooped in on a grieving widow's financial difficulties and leveraged them into a courtship, which was not an accurate description of what had happened, but which had the advantage of being easy to explain and easy to misread. Pauline heard about this secondhand from the mercantile owner's wife 3 days later. She went to Albert and told him what she had heard. He listened without visible anger, which she had come to understand was not absence of feeling but the particular way he processed it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "What he says doesn't change anything real unless it bothers you." "It doesn't bother me," he said. "I'm more interested in whether it bothers you." She thought about it. "It would have bothered me a year ago," she said. "The idea of people talking about my situation, my choices. I was very protective of not being a subject of conversation." She paused. "I find that I care less now, I think because I am less afraid of being seen." He looked at her with that warm, open expression that still sometimes caught her off guard despite months of it. "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Prout's whisper campaign went nowhere because the valley had watched Pauline Bishop hold her land together through grief and debt and drought with her own hands and her own will. And the valley had watched Albert Wallace be a good neighbor in the specific, practical ways that mattered. And nobody with clear eyes was going to accept the narrative that something sinister had happened between them. It faded like most things that lack a foundation, quickly and without ceremony. What grew instead, in the spring and into the summer, was a courtship that Pauline would later describe as the slow discovery of something she had not known was possible. Not the fierce, romantic certainty that Thomas had offered her in Cincinnati, the sweeping declaration that had felt like being lifted off the ground. Something different, something that had the quality of ground itself, solid and enduring and deeper the further you went into it. They rode the valley together in the long evenings when the light turned everything amber and the shadows stretched east and the air smelled of cooling earth. They read to each other on alternating porches, his Whitman and her Thoreau, and a shared discovery of a novel she had not expected to find at the Cutter's Creek Lending Library that turned out to be exactly right for reading aloud in the evenings. They went to church together, which the valley noted and accepted with a collective nod, and they sat at the same table for church socials without the elaborate casualness of the early days, just sitting together because they wanted to be in the same space. He learned what she needed and was careful about the specific texture of his care. She did not want to be managed or protected from difficulty. She wanted to be alongside someone who trusted her capacity. He gave her that. When the fence problem on the northeast section required a solution she had not figured out yet, he offered 3 possible approaches and asked which she thought most applicable, and when she chose one, he did not second-guess it. When she told him she needed a particular afternoon alone because there were days when the grief still arrived with a heaviness that required solitude to process, he accepted this without injury, which was the exact correct response, and which told her more about his character than any number of impressive gestures could have. She told him about Thomas, not carefully edited memories, but real ones, the beautiful declarations and the impracticality. The loan he had taken without telling her, which she had moved past anger about but which remained as a kind of cautionary note about the things people hide from each other out of love. The way he had laughed at the worst moments, genuinely, freely, which had sometimes infuriated her, and which she missed with a specific acuteness that she could not always predict. Albert listened to all of it with the full gravity of someone who understands that a person's past is not competition but context. "Were you happy?" he asked once. "Most of the time," she said honestly, Complicated often, but most of the time, yes. That's what I want to know, he said, that it's possible for you. She looked at him. Albert, I'm happy now, right now talking to you. I want you to know that. The summer of 1884 was long and hot and productive. Governor's offspring were shaping up well, 2 colts and a filly from the Rimrock mares, and the demand for quality horses in the territory was strong. The Broken Spur was running at a genuine profit for the first time since Thomas died, and Pauline had hired back a second ranch hand and was planning to expand the herd in the fall. She felt, for the first time in years, like she was building something rather than defending something, and the distinction was significant. In August, Albert asked her to marry him. He did it without ceremony or elaborate staging, which was consistent with who he was. They were at the windmill in the eastern pasture, which she had ridden out to check, because one of the vanes was making a noise she wanted to investigate, and he had come along because they went places together now, and they were standing in the late afternoon heat looking at the windmill, while the good south wind turned the vanes and pumped the water up from the deep desert underground, and he said, I would like to spend the rest of my life doing this with you. She looked at the windmill. Checking windmill vanes. Being in the same place as you, he said, whatever the place requires. She turned to face him. The sun was in the west, and the light was that particular August gold that made everything in the valley look like something worth keeping forever. He was watching her with his dark eyes and his hands at his sides and no performance in any part of him. I love you, she said. It came out without the careful preparation she had imagined giving it, just the truth, arriving in its own time. I want you to know that before you ask, because it's not a condition of the answer. It's just true. Something in his face was so open and so real that she felt it from the inside of her own chest outward. I love you, he said. I have loved you since you told me the valley was your cathedral in your own particular way that had nothing to do with religion. Will you marry me, Pauline? Yes, she said. Yes, Albert, I'll marry you. He put his hands on her face, careful and warm, and kissed her, and the windmill turned and the Arizona sun laid itself across the eastern pasture, and somewhere in the valley, a hawk made its long, tilting circle over what was, in every way that mattered, their land. They were married in October of 1884, which was Pauline's particular month, the one that made her feel most like herself, in the Cutter's Creek Church on a Saturday morning, with the whole valley present, because the whole valley had been waiting for this with varying degrees of patience, for considerably longer than either of them had realized. Pauline wore a dress of blue wool that she had made herself over the course of 3 weeks, with a focus that Rosa had found alarming and practical and moving in equal measure. Albert wore his best coat and a new hat that he had ordered from Tucson, and that he confided to her before the ceremony was causing him anxiety, because he was not certain it fit correctly, which she found so genuinely endearing that she had to compose herself before they walked to the front of the church together. The minister was a precise, kind man named Reverend Hastings, who performed the ceremony with dignity, and managed not to make any of the usual observations about second marriages or widowhood that Pauline had steeled herself to endure, for which she was quietly grateful. Dinah, who had stayed through all of it, through Thomas's death and the 18 months of managing alone and the courtship and now this, sat in the front row with his hat on his knee and a smile on his face that was the size of the whole valley. Albert's vows were not the scripted ones. He had asked the Reverend in advance to permit him a personal addition, and Reverend Hastings, who had learned to accommodate the particular requirements of people who had been through things, had agreed. Albert said, looking at Pauline with all of himself present and accounted for, I promise to stand on the right side of whatever fence you're mending. I promise to read anything you want read. I promise not to keep secrets that belong to both of us, and I promise to be, as best I can, worth every day you give me. The church was very quiet. Pauline said her own addition, which she had written sitting at her kitchen table at midnight, and which she delivered in the steady voice that she had cultivated for 18 months as armor and which now served, for the first time, as something else. "I closed my heart against this valley and everything in it," she said, "because I thought that was how you survived losing someone. You were patient enough to wait until I understood that survival is not the same as living. I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making that distinction." There was a sound in the church that was almost silence and almost not. They rode out to their combined ranch, because of course the practical discussion of which property to base their marriage on had resulted in the obvious conclusion that they would operate both, with the Rimrock as the primary operation and the Broken Spurs eastern pasture becoming the dedicated horse breeding ground, Governor's Domain, the windmill turning in the south wind above it all. Rosa, who had opinions about the domestic arrangements that were not shy and that she expressed freely, had spent 3 days making the Rimrock kitchen and sitting room suitable for a woman with Pauline's specific aesthetic, which she had deduced accurately through a combination of observation and conversation with Dino, who was now working as head ranch hand at the combined operation, and who approved of everything about the situation, except that no one had asked his opinion before now. The sitting room had a new bookshelf that ran along 2 walls. Pauline stood in it on her wedding afternoon and looked at the 2 walls of books, her volumes and Albert's, arranged together on the same shelves with no particular organizational principle except that they were all there, and she felt something settle in her that she had not known was still unsettled. Albert came to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, warm and solid and sure, and she leaned back into him and let herself do it fully, without calculation, without the half-second of self-protection that had preceded every moment of contact for 2 years. "We're going to fill 2 more shelves before we're done," he said. "At minimum," she agreed. That first year of marriage was the particular education of 2 people who have each spent significant time learning to be independent, finding out what it means to be genuinely together. There were adjustments. Pauline's morning habits, which were extremely specific, and which included 30 minutes alone with coffee before she was prepared to speak to anyone, were accommodated without comment by Albert, who was a man who had read enough to understand that people have internal architectures that deserve respect. Albert's way of processing conflict, which was to go very still and very quiet rather than to speak, was something she had to learn not to read as coldness, and once she understood it, she found she could work with it, sitting with him in the quiet until he was ready and trusting that he would get there. They had their first real argument in February of 1885, which was about money, because it is often about money, specifically about a capital investment Albert wanted to make in expanding the horse operation that Pauline felt was moving too fast too soon. It was a real disagreement between 2 people with strong, informed opinions and a genuine partnership interest in the outcome. They argued about it with complete honesty and considerable volume, and then they sat across from each other in the kitchen in the aftermath, and she said, "I'm going to be angry about this for at least an hour," and he said, "That seems reasonable," and she almost laughed, and then she did laugh, and the argument was not resolved yet, but the ground between them was solid. They compromised. They expanded at a pace that was between his ambition and her caution, and by the fall they had to acknowledge that his instinct had been right about the market timing and her caution had been right about the pace, and they were both correct and neither of them gloated, which they counted as a considerable marital achievement. Pauline told Albert she was expecting a child in March of 1885, on a Thursday morning over breakfast, stating it plainly and directly because that was how she communicated things that mattered. Albert put down his coffee cup very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands are not entirely steady, and looked at her across the table with an expression that she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life as one of the perfect things. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I'm well," she said. He came around the table and took her face in his hands and looked at her with everything he was. "I am," he said, and then he seemed to realize he did not have the rest of the sentence, and he laughed, a surprised, full, real laugh, and she smiled at him. And in the warm kitchen of the Rimrock Ranch house on a March morning in 1885, they sat together with their foreheads touching and the news between them like a warm light. Their son was born in November of 1885, which Pauline thought afterward was probably the universe exercising some kind of humor about the month that had begun all the most significant changes in her life. Labor and delivery were managed by the midwife from Cutter's Creek, a capable, practical woman named Mrs. Donahue, who had delivered half the children in the valley and who brooked no drama during the process. Albert was outside the bedroom door for the entire duration, which Mrs. Donahue reported lasted 11 hours, and which Albert reportedly spent doing absolutely nothing useful except listening. They named the boy Thomas James Wallace. Thomas for the man who had brought her to the valley that had become her life, James for Albert's father who had given him books and fortitude. Pauline made this decision and told Albert, and he held the small, red-faced, thoroughly opinionated baby in his large hands and said it was exactly right. Thomas James Wallace was, from the first day of his existence, a person of remarkable and exhausting character. He was loud and curious and determined, and prone to strong opinions about things that he could not yet articulate, and he was adored absolutely by both of his parents and by Dinah, who treated him with the gentle solemnity of a man who has waited for something worthwhile, and by Rosa, who had views about child-rearing that she expressed freely and who was almost always correct. The valley watched all of this and found it entirely satisfying. Gideon Prout, who had harbored his resentment through the courtship and the wedding, found that a baby made the whole narrative harder to maintain and eventually let it go, helped along by the fact that his own personal situation improved when he married a woman named Charlotte, who was from Tucson and who had no patience for grudges, and whose influence on the general trajectory of his character was marked and positive. The years at the combined Rimrock and Broken Spur operation developed into something that neither Pauline nor Albert had fully projected when they made their business arrangement over a fence in the fall of 1883. The horse breeding operation became genuinely significant in the territory, Governor's bloodline establishing a reputation that brought buyers from as far as Denver and Santa Fe, and the cattle operation, run with the combined acumen of two people who understood land and animal and market, became consistently profitable in a way that neither operation had been individually. Dino became, without any particular ceremony, the essential third cornerstone of the whole enterprise. Albert paid him a full senior wage and consulted him on every significant operational decision, and Pauline made sure he knew that the Broken Spur was his home as long as he chose it to be, which was a conversation she had initiated after Thomas James was born, sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts between them, telling him plainly that he had stayed when he had every reason to go, and that this was not a debt she was prepared to leave unacknowledged. Dino had listened to all of this with his characteristic stillness, and then said, "You were worth staying for, Mrs. Wallace," in the measured, complete way of a man who says exactly what he means and nothing additional. Pauline had looked at the accounts until she was certain her expression was appropriate. In the spring of 1887, Pauline found herself expecting their second child. Thomas James was 18 months old and fully occupying every available square inch of the adults around him, and she told Albert about the second baby with the particular combination of joy and logistics that characterized the announcement when you already had a small person at home turning everything upside down. Albert received the news with the same open, genuine warmth as the first time, with the addition of a wry observation about the size of the house and whether they ought to consider expanding the east wing, which was a conversation they had been putting off and which now became practical. The east wing expansion was completed by late summer, and their daughter arrived in October, which Pauline had privately suspected and which amused her enormously, the valley's best month providing the best addition. They named her Rose Clara Wallace, and she was dark-eyed like Albert, and had her mother's absolute certainty about what she wanted from the world, which manifested itself from the first week of her existence as a trait both impressive and challenging. Thomas James, presented with his new sister with the careful management of a household that had read the literature on sibling introductions, looked at her for a long moment and then declared her satisfactory, which Rosa said was the most Albert thing anyone under 2 had ever done, and which made Pauline laugh so hard she had to sit down. The life they built at the Rimrock was full in every sense of the word. Full of work, the particular demanding, physical, endlessly complex work of running a large ranch operation in the Arizona Territory in the late 1880s. Full of the community that the valley generated through its gatherings and its crises and its celebrations. Full of the books that continued to accumulate on the 2-walled shelves and spilled onto new shelves in the bedroom and in Albert's office, and eventually into a small reading room that the East Wing expansion had included, because both of them had independently put it on their requirements list without consulting each other, and then laughed about it when they compared notes. Full of the evening habit they had developed and continued for the rest of their lives, of sitting on the porch when the day's work was done, the children asleep or occupied, the valley spread out below them in whatever light the hour provided, talking about things that mattered and things that did not, and sometimes nothing at all, just being in the same place together, which had been what Albert wanted when he asked her to marry him, and which it turned out was everything. Thomas's windmill turned in the eastern pasture through all of it. She rode out to it sometimes alone in the early mornings, and sat with the complicated feelings that Thomas still occasionally summoned. She had made her peace with the love she had carried for him, understanding over the years that it did not need to diminish to make room for what she had with Albert. The love for Thomas was finished, complete, a whole thing. The love for Albert was ongoing and expanding and different in almost every way. Both were real. Both were hers. This was not, she had come to understand, a contradiction but a truth about the particular generosity of the human heart when it is given the conditions to open. Albert knew about her morning rides to the windmill. He had known since the first time she took one, 6 weeks after their marriage, and he had never once questioned them or expressed anything that suggested he found them threatening. He was the man he was, and she was grateful for it every time she thought about it, which was frequently. In the fall of 1889, on the day that Arizona Territory newspapers reported that the movement toward full statehood was gaining significant legislative momentum, Albert and Pauline rode the eastern pasture together to check on the cattle that were grazing there through the October season. Thomas James was 4 years old now and had a pony of his own, a patient gray animal named Smoke, and he rode it with the fearless confidence of a child who has grown up entirely surrounded by horses and who considers them essentially furniture with opinions. Rose Clara, at 2, had opinions about the pony that she expressed with clarity from her position in front of her father on his horse. They stopped at the windmill. The vanes turned in the good south wind. The valley stretched out around them, gold and brown and beautiful in the October afternoon, the red cliffs in the distance catching the light the way they always caught it this time of day, burning and whole. Thomas would have loved this, Pauline said, looking at the children. He would have been very proud of you, Albert said. Of all of this, she looked at him. I think he would have liked you, she said. You are both men who believe in building things that outlast the building. Albert reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she let him hold it, looking at the valley that had been her cathedral and her grief and her proving ground and her home, the valley she had closed herself against and which had refused, through the agency of one patient, stubborn, deeply good man, to let her stay closed. Thomas James said something about the windmill, a question about how it worked delivered in the urgent, demanding way of a 4-year-old, and Albert explained it to him with complete seriousness, and Rose Clara fell asleep against Albert's chest with the absolute trust of a child who has never known anything but safety. Pauline held her husband's hand and watched her children and listened to the windmill turn and let the valley in, all the way in, the way she had not let it in, until she understood that the door she had closed was not protecting her but only keeping her alone. The seasons turned, as they do. The work of the ranch continued, as work does, never entirely finished and never entirely beyond completion, always the next fence and the next season, and the next thing that the land required and gave back in return. Albert's hair went gray at the temples by his early 40s, which Pauline told him improved him considerably, and he told her that she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in any season, which he said without ceremony and meant without qualification, and she believed him because she had learned by then to recognize the particular sound of Albert Wallace saying something true. Thomas James grew into a young man who was, in the assessment of everyone who knew him, his father's steadiness and his mother's fire, which was a combination that suggested interesting things for his future. He understood horses with an instinctive depth that made Albert proud in the specific way that parents are proud when a child exceeds rather than simply replicates. He helped run the Broken Spurs horse operation with the seriousness of a person who understands that what you inherit you also inherit the obligation to sustain. Rose Clara grew into a young woman who had views about everything and the confidence to express them, which she got from both parents, and which the Valley found alternately admirable and overwhelming. She showed a gift for the accounts and the business side of the operation that Pauline recognized as the part of herself she had cultivated alone in the hard months, and it pleased her in a way she could not entirely explain to see it in her daughter as something that did not need hardship to develop. They had a third child, a boy they named James Albert Wallace, in 1891, because the house had room and their lives had the particular solidity that could accommodate another person without strain. James Albert was quieter than his siblings, a thoughtful, observant child who would sit with books at an age when most children were running the yard, and who would look up from them with Albert's eyes full of whatever he had just been reading and announce conclusions that required the adults around him to sit down. Rosa taught all three of them to cook, which she considered a fundamental life skill regardless of gender, and Dino taught all three of them to ride and to read the land, and Albert and Pauline taught all three of them, by example rather than instruction, the things that could not be put in a curriculum. How to work at something genuinely difficult without resentment. How to be honest when honesty is the harder choice. How to love someone in the specific, practical, daily way that outlasts the seasons and the difficulties and the occasional moments when love is less a feeling and more a decision. The books on the shelves multiplied. The porch conversations continued. The valley turned from August to October and back again, the windmill in the eastern pasture marking the passage not of time, but of something larger and less nameable, the way certain things in certain places mark the passage of lives being fully lived. On a particular evening in October of 1893, 10 years after the first stud fee arrangement had been proposed over a fence in the valley heat, Pauline sat on the rimrock porch with Albert in the chairs they had been sitting in for a decade, and the October evening did what it always did, which was to make everything look exactly like it meant something. Albert said, "Are you happy?" The question he had asked over the hotel stew in December of 1883, when she was managing and the land was under threat, and the door inside her was as firmly closed as she knew how to make it. She looked at the valley. She thought about what she would have said then and what she had learned since. She thought about Thomas and the windmill, and the February wind, and the bank letter, and the fence lines, and the books, and the children asleep inside and Dino, in the bunkhouse who had stayed for reasons that were more about loyalty than wages, and Rosa in her quarters who had long since become something that did not have a simple word in English, and the stud fees, and the evening rides, and the Whitman, and the green chili stew, and all the small specific accumulations of a life that is genuinely and fully lived. Yes, she said, absolutely and completely yes. He took her hand the way he always took it, without ceremony and without question, the way you hold something that belongs with you. The valley lay before them in the last October light, the red cliffs burning, the windmill turning, the cattle moving in the eastern pasture where Thomas's cathedral stood open to the sky, and Pauline Bishop Wallace, who had closed her heart against all of it and had been patiently, stubbornly, lovingly refused by the man beside her, held her husband's hand and watched the day end, and felt the particular grace of a woman who has found her way back from the closed room to the wide, warm, endlessly sufficient world. The stars came out one by one over the Arizona territory, the same stars that had always been there, and the porch was warm with the day's retained heat, and somewhere in the house, a child called out in sleep and went quiet again, and the windmill turned, and the valley held them as it had always been capable of holding them, waiting only for them to be ready to let it.